On a quiet Saturday morning in Texas, a man stepped outside to take out his trash, only to find two armed strangers and his HOA president waiting to arrest him. What none of them knew was that they had just picked the wrong driveway and the wrong man. It was the kind of Saturday morning Plano Texas was built for. Sunlight fell soft across two-story brick homes, sprinklers whispered on freshly cut lawns, and kids pedaled their bikes in lazy circles around the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood looked like a postcard of suburban calm. Reginald Carter stepped out his front door with nothing more on his mind than taking the trash to the curb. A simple routine. A man in gym shorts and a t-shirt, carrying a bag that crinkled with soda cans and last night's leftovers. He barely made it 10 steps down his driveway when he noticed something that didn't belong. At the edge of the sidewalk stood three figures. Linda Whitfield, the president of the Homeowners Association, flanked by two men in mismatched tactical vests. Big block patches stitched across their chests read Community Enforcement, but the lettering looked cheap, the Velcro peeling at the edges. Their boots were scuffed like they'd been bought secondhand, and the way they stood was too stiff, too rehearsed, like actors still learning their lines. They weren't smiling. Neither was Linda. Reginald slowed, the trash bag swinging at his side. He took them in with the kind of glance that missed nothing. To a nervous neighbor peering through a window, the scene might have looked official, like some new branch of law and order had arrived. But Reginald had lived long enough, seen enough, to know when something was off. One of the men, tall and pale with a shaved head, let his hand hover near his belt, as if the gesture alone could create authority. His partner, shorter with a messy beard, mirrored the stance awkwardly, his thumb brushing the edge of his vest where a badge should have been but wasn't. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like procedure. To Reginald, it looked like theater. Linda's voice cut the quiet, sharp and rehearsed. "Mr. Carter, we need to talk." The words carried like a summons. Reginald set the trash bag gently on the driveway, his hands resting calmly on his hips. About what? His tone was even, but the air around them thickened. The tall man in shades stepped forward, boots grinding against the concrete as though claiming territory. "Community enforcement," he said flatly. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations." His mirrored glasses made it impossible to see his eyes, but his jaw flexed tight, waiting for submission. The words felt heavy, deliberate, as if recited from a script. Reginald's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Violation," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the word. A breeze shifted through the trees. From a house across the street, a curtain moved, a flash of a neighbor's face vanishing back into the shadows. The street seemed to pause, holding its breath. The bearded man shifted his weight. The tall one let his hand tap against the empty space on his belt again, a silent message meant to intimidate. Reginald noticed every detail: the cheap stitching on the vest, the sloppy Velcro straps, the way they spread their feet too wide like men who had seen authority on television and tried to mimic it. And Linda standing between them, arms crossed tight. Her chin lifted with a brittle kind of confidence that cracked at the edges. The normal sounds of the block, birds, children's laughter, the hum of a lawn mower seemed to fade into the background. In their place hung a silence that pressed in from every direction. Reginald tilted his head, calm but razor-sharp. The game had shifted. What should have been a simple walk to the curb had turned into a confrontation. Three people stood on his property, pretending they carried weight. But their posture betrayed them, their eyes gave them away. They weren't law, they weren't officers. They were trespassers playing dress-up. Yet the way the tall man's hand lingered near his waist suggested they were willing to escalate. That single movement changed the tone of everything. This wasn't just petty HOA drama. It smelled like danger. And for the first time that morning, the quiet street of Plano no longer felt safe. The sun caught on the cheap stitching of their vests, throwing harsh light across words that looked official only if you didn't know better. Community enforcement. It sounded weighty, but under the Texas glare it looked like what it was, mismatched gear from a surplus store. Reginald stood quietly in his driveway, hands relaxed at his sides, while Linda stepped forward with the kind of authority she had always tried to manufacture. Her voice was sharp, almost triumphant. "You've ignored repeated notices, Mr. Carter. This is no longer a matter of courtesy. You are in violation of our neighborhood standards." She snapped her fingers, and the bearded man, Sean, pulled a folded paper from his vest. His hands shook slightly as he read aloud. "Failure to maintain lawn on designated day. Unauthorized paint color on driveway border. Vehicle parked outside overnight against regulations." He looked up quickly, eyes darting to Linda for approval, then continued. "Reports of loud gatherings past curfew. Multiple complaints filed." The tall man, Eddie, shifted his stance and added flatly, "We're here to detain you until the police arrive." The word hung in the air like a lead weight. Detain. As if two men in dollar store armor and a suburban board president had the power to strip someone of freedom. From a window across the street, a curtain flicked closed. Another cracked open 2 houses down. Neighbors were watching, but no one had stepped outside yet. Phones hovered just out of sight, lenses waiting. Reginald let the silence work, then tilted his head slightly, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "Detain me," he repeated softly, almost as if testing the sound of it. His calm carried more weight than their threats. Linda crossed her arms tighter. "You've left us no choice. This neighborhood runs on order, and you've chosen to ignore it. These men are authorized to enforce compliance." Her chin lifted with brittle pride. Eddie's mirrored shades flashed as he leaned forward. "Come peacefully, or we'll make it harder." Reginald studied him the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, cataloging every fracture in his confidence. He didn't move, didn't even raise his voice. "You're standing on my property," he said, steady as stone. "And you don't have a badge, you don't have authority. You don't have a clue how deep in trouble you already are." Sean shifted uneasily, his boots scraping on concrete. The paper in his hand trembled just enough for Reginald to notice. The list of so-called charges fluttered in the breeze, absurd on its face. Grass cut on the wrong day, driveway the wrong shade, a car parked half a foot beyond a line. It would have been comical if not for the way Eddie's hand hovered near his belt again, like he wanted the crowd to imagine a weapon. Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice calm but edged. "This is what you call violations. This is your case. You believe this gives you the right to trespass and threaten." The absurdity of it began to ripple through the street. Behind blinds, neighbors whispered. From a porch, the faint click of a phone camera carried in the still air. A woman's voice murmured, "Is she serious?" Linda ignored the cracks forming in her illusion. "This neighborhood has rules for a reason," she snapped. "Without enforcement, there's chaos." Reginald let out a low breath, almost a chuckle. "What you're doing isn't enforcement, it's theater, and bad theater at that." Eddie stiffened at the insult, his jaw tightening behind the mirrored shades. Sean glanced toward him, then back at Linda, doubt creeping in. The longer the exchange dragged on, the thinner their authority looked. And the neighbors, half hidden but listening to every word, could feel it too. What started as an attempt to corner one man was already unraveling into something else. The illusion of power was cracking, and the crowd that Linda thought would stay silent was beginning to see through the act. From behind drawn curtains, the neighborhood was awake now. Blinds twitched, shades lifted just enough for faces to press against the glass. Phones began to glow in the half-shadow, little blue lights blinking like fireflies in the morning sun. Across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson stood on their porch, whispering. "She's finally lost it," he muttered, shaking his head. His wife clutched her robe tighter. "I told you Linda would go too far one day." the whispers traveled. House to house, like sparks catching in dry grass. It wasn't just Reginald's driveway anymore. The entire block was tuned in, watching silently as if the street itself had turned into a courtroom. On the sidewalk, a teenager, Marcus Johnson, lifted his phone higher. His voice carried in a hushed mix of nerves and excitement. "Yo, Mr. Carter, I got you on live." The words sliced through the tension like a flare in the dark. Eddie's head snapped toward him, mirrored shades reflecting the boy's phone screen. "Put that down," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. He took a step off the driveway toward the kid, boots grinding like the sound of threat itself. The crowd behind curtains seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing heavy. For a moment it felt as though the whole block leaned forward, waiting to see what came next. Reginald moved before anyone else could blink. He shifted smoothly, cutting his body between Eddie and the teenager, shoulders squared, his stance rooted. His voice dropped low, calm, but carrying a razor's edge. "You even think about touching that kid, and this ends right here." The air froze. The soda can that had rolled from his trash bag earlier still lay on the concrete, glinting under the sun, as if marking the line that could not be crossed. Eddie faltered just enough for everyone to notice. Behind the glass, mouths fell open. On the Hendersons' porch, Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly. The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable, stretched over several long seconds. Sean shifted uneasily, his weight rocking from one boot to the other, eyes darting from Eddie to Linda as if begging someone else to take control. Linda tried to fill the void with her own voice. "This is a neighborhood matter," she snapped. "None of you should be interfering." But her words rang hollow, bouncing against windows already filled with silent witnesses. From halfway down the street, a woman holding her baby on her hip shouted suddenly, "Neighborhood matter. This looks like harassment to me." Her voice carried strong and clear, cutting through the tension. Then came another. "You can't arrest your neighbor for grass being too long." A man called from his porch, shaking his head. The silence fractured, replaced by murmurs, sharper now, louder. The whispers were no longer private. They belonged to the crowd. Phones shifted, pointed squarely at Linda and her enforcers. Someone stepped fully onto their porch, recording openly. The line between spectator and judge had vanished. Reginald stood steady, not raising his voice, not flexing a muscle beyond what was needed. The weight of the crowd was moving in his favor, and he knew it. Linda's authority was bleeding out in real time. She could feel it too. Her jaw tightened, her face flushed. "Don't let him manipulate you," she shouted desperately. "He thinks he's above the rules." But no one listened. Every neighbor could see the imbalance. A man with nothing but a trash bag had been cornered by imposters in borrowed uniforms, and instead of backing down, he had stood his ground, calm and unshaken. Marcus lowered his phone for just a second and whispered, almost to himself, but loud enough to be caught on other mics, "Everybody's watching. Thousands." The tall man stiffened, sweat prickling at his temples. The illusion was slipping faster than he could control. What began as Linda's attempt to stage authority had transformed into something else entirely. This was no longer about HOA fines or neighborhood rules. It was trial by community, and the verdict was already beginning to take shape. Reginald wasn't alone anymore. The street had chosen its side, and every camera pointed at him made sure the truth would not be buried. The Texas sun climbed higher, pouring light across the brick homes until Reginald's driveway looked less like suburban concrete and more like the floor of a courtroom where the verdict could swing either way. The crowd behind glass was restless now. Curtains fluttered, phones angled, whispers grew into low hums. The silence had weight, and everyone felt it. Eddie, the tall one with the shaved head, finally broke it. He stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary that separated the street from Reginald's property. The move was bold, too bold. His boots scraped hard against the concrete, as if he wanted everyone to hear him claim the space. The mirrored shades on his face caught the sunlight and threw it back cold. With a sudden jerk of his hand, he reached into his vest and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. The metal clanked as they unfolded, the sound cutting sharper than any shout. Gasps rippled through the street. Behind their blinds, neighbors froze as though the sound alone had put them in chains. "You're under neighborhood arrest," Eddie barked. His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the pressure boiling beneath his tough shell. He thrust the cuffs forward like a weapon, his intent clear. He wasn't bluffing anymore. He was ready to put his hands on Reginald. Linda's voice exploded behind him, shrill and triumphant. "Do it, put him in cuffs. Show him he's not above the rules." Her arms were folded tight, but her eyes gleamed with the desperate pride of someone who thought control was finally within reach. The moment stretched thin. Sean stood a step behind, his body betraying doubt. His boots shifted, his shoulders sagged, and his eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd that was no longer pretending to be hidden. He whispered, "Maybe we should wait," but Eddie ignored him, jaw locked in stubborn defiance. Reginald didn't move back. He stood planted, calm as stone in the heat. His eyes flicked from the cuffs to Eddie's trembling hand, then back to his face. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried like thunder. "You take one step toward me with those cuffs and you've just committed a felony, impersonating an officer. Attempted unlawful restraint. That's prison time. Not a fine, not a warning. Prison." Eddie's grip faltered for a split second, just enough for the crowd to see the crack in his armor. Sean swallowed hard, sweat streaking his temple. The neighbors saw it too. Murmurs rose into open shouts. "That's not the law, Linda." One man yelled from his porch. "You don't have the right." A woman added, voice trembling but strong enough to carry down the street. Phones tilted higher, recording every second, every breath, every twitch of Eddie's hand. The tension climbed like a fever. Reginald tilted his head, calm, almost pitying. "Go ahead," he said evenly. "Show the world who you really are." Eddie's jaw clenched tighter. His pride was a leash pulling him forward, dragging him into a fight he wasn't built to finish. He shoved Sean aside, lifting the cuffs higher, his arms shaking as if weighed down by more than metal. The crowd gasped as one, a single sound rolling down the block. Parents pulled children closer, the Hendersons clutched each other's hands, and Marcus's live stream caught every angle of the confrontation. Linda stepped closer, voice rising above the noise. "Don't let him intimidate you. He thinks he's untouchable. Show him this community has order." But her words no longer inspired. They rang desperate, hollow. Every eye was on Eddie, every phone waiting for the moment he crossed the line. Reginald didn't flinch. His voice stayed steady, razor sharp. "Son, I've dealt with cartel enforcers who were less reckless than you. Do yourself a favor. Put them down before you destroy your life in front of your whole neighborhood." For a second, Eddie froze. His hand shook, the cuffs rattling audibly in the quiet. Sean tried again, louder this time. "Eddie, this is crazy. We can't actually cuff him. Cameras are rolling. We'll get locked up ourselves." But Eddie shoved him back with a grunt, eyes fixed on Reginald like a man possessed. The crowd erupted louder, voices overlapping. "Call the cops," someone screamed. "This is harassment," another shouted. Every sound pressed down on Eddie, every lens magnified his shame. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. The metal cuffs gleamed in the sun, suspended in the air between them, the last line before chaos. The neighborhood held its breath, balanced on the edge of violence. What had begun as a petty HOA stunt had escalated to the brink of a crime, and everyone watching knew the next move would decide everything. The cuffs glinted once in the sun before Eddie lunged. His boots hammered against the concrete, his arm shooting forward with all the weight of his pride behind it. The crowd screamed as one, a chorus of gasps and shouts, parents pulling children back, phones jerking to capture the moment. For an instant it looked like the neighborhood was about to watch a man dragged off in chains. But then everything shifted. Reginald moved. It was not frantic, not panicked. It was precise, practiced, like a rhythm drilled into muscle long ago. In one fluid motion he stepped aside, caught Eddie's wrist, twisted the arm, and snapped the cuffs around it before Eddie even knew what had happened. The tall man cried out, stumbling forward, his knees buckling under the sudden torque. In less than 3 seconds, the hunter was the one bound, one arm yanked behind his back, metal clamping shut with a finality that silenced the street. For a beat, no one breathed. Even the birds overhead seemed to fall quiet. Eddie's mirrored shades tilted sideways, reflecting back the image of his own defeat as he knelt on Reginald's driveway. The bearded partner froze, mouth open, sweat dripping down his temple. Linda's face drained of color, her shriek caught in her throat. Reginald stood over Eddie without raising his voice, without gloating. He held him steady, minimal force, like a man taking out the trash rather than breaking down an aggressor. The silence stretched, a deliberate pause, and Reginald let it hang. The neighbors, their cameras trained on him, whispered to each other, their voices carried across the block. "Did you see that?" one muttered. "He didn't even fight back," another whispered. "He just moved." Reginald kept still, his expression unreadable. He wanted them to wonder, to connect the dots before he handed them the answer. Eddie writhed once, trying to pull free, but the cuffs were locked. His arm pinned neatly behind his back. He wasn't in control anymore, and everyone watching could see it. The pause lingered, deliberate, like the moment in a courtroom before a verdict is read. Reginald's neighbors leaned closer to their screens and porches, their collective anticipation turning the air electric. And then, with quiet precision, he reached into his back pocket. The crowd tilted their phones higher, hungry. A small, worn leather wallet flipped open. Sunlight caught on the badge inside, gold gleaming like a sudden revelation. Reginald raised it just high enough for everyone to see. "Special Agent Reginald Carter," he said, his voice calm, steady, undeniable. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words hit harder than any fist could. The block erupted. Gasps, shouts, even laughter cracked through the tension. Marcus's live stream caught the badge perfectly, zooming in as the chat exploded with disbelief. "No way," someone shouted from a porch. "He's FBI." The Hendersons clutched each other, Mrs. Henderson whispering, "I knew he carried himself different." Eddie sagged further, the last of his bravado shattering as the truth sank in. Sean stepped back like he'd been struck, his vest suddenly feeling like a costume he couldn't tear off fast enough. Linda shook her head violently, her words spilling, desperate. "This is abuse of power, you can't, this isn't," but no one listened anymore. Reginald's eyes locked on her, quiet steel behind them. "Abuse of power," he said, his tone cutting clean. "That's rich, coming from the woman who brought imposters to a man's doorstep." The neighbors murmured again, their voices edged with disgust. Cameras caught every angle, Eddie cuffed on his knees, Sean unraveling, Linda trembling as the authority she thought she held collapsed around her. Reginald stood tall, calm, his badge catching the sunlight like a seal on a verdict. He hadn't just defended himself, he had exposed them. What had started as a petty HOA ambush had flipped in seconds, and the neighborhood would never see him the same way again. The wail of sirens rolled down the block like a storm approaching, faint at first, then sharper, closer, impossible to ignore. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the brick faces of the houses, painting them in flickers of law and order that no vest or patch could counterfeit. Neighbors shifted, leaning further onto porches, some stepping fully into the street now, their phones capturing every second. The theater was over. The real stage was being set. Reginald held Eddie steady on his knees, the cuffs locked tight around the man's wrists. He raised one hand slowly, showing he had control without resistance, and called out in a clear, steady tone, "Officer's badge is in my wallet. Identification ready. Suspect attempted impersonation and unlawful restraint on my property." The squad cars swung to a stop at angles across the street, tires crunching gravel, doors flying open. Uniformed officers stepped out, hands near their belts, eyes sharp. They scanned the scene quickly, one man cuffed, one standing frozen, one woman trembling with defiance. Their attention locked on the badge glinting in Reginald's hand. One officer, broad-shouldered, approached cautiously. "Sir, credentials." Reginald produced his wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. The officer studied the gold seal, then looked into Reginald's eyes. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, followed by respect. "All right, Agent Carter," he said firmly, his voice carrying. "We'll take it from here." Relief rippled across the crowd like a breeze after a storm. Murmurs broke into soft cheers, neighbors clapping each other's shoulders, recording with renewed energy. The officers pulled Eddie to his feet, his bravado gone, his body sagging as they walked him toward the patrol car. The crowd jeered softly, not with cruelty, but with the satisfaction of seeing the mask ripped away. Sean, the bearded partner, backed up instinctively, hands raised as though surrendering before anyone asked. His voice cracked when he spoke. "It wasn't me, it wasn't my idea. Linda brought us in, she told us what to say, she told us we had authority." His confession wasn't whispered. It carried across the block, loud enough for every neighbor to hear. Phones tilted to catch his face, his words, his betrayal of the woman who had orchestrated everything. Linda's eyes went wide, her mouth opening and closing, scrambling for control. Then she shouted, voice shrill, desperate, "I am the president of this HOA. I have authority here. You can't do this to me." But her words landed flat. A voice from the crowd shouted back instantly, "So what? That doesn't mean anything." Another neighbor added, "If you're the president, you should have known better." The block erupted, not with applause, but with outrage, the voices of ordinary people stripping away the last shield she thought she had. The irony cut sharp and clean. The very title she clung to as protection became her indictment. She wasn't just another resident making a mistake. She was the one who had power, the one who was supposed to understand the law, and she had twisted it into a weapon. Now everyone knew it. Reginald didn't raise his voice, but his words were clear enough for her and the crowd both. "That title doesn't place you above the law, it makes you more accountable to it." The officers exchanged glances. One stepped toward Linda, eyes firm. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside and answer some questions." The crowd buzzed louder, pressing the moment into memory. Phones zoomed in as Linda's face flushed crimson, her chin trembling as she tried to stand tall. But no one believed her anymore. The illusion of her authority had shattered under real lights, real badges, and the eyes of a neighborhood that would never forget. The street had become an open-air courtroom, every porch a jury box, every phone a witness stand. The red and blue lights still washed over the brick homes, but it was the glow of countless live streams that gave the moment its weight. Linda stood rigid in the center of it all, her arms folded like a shield, her voice climbing higher with each denial. "This is a mistake," she barked at the officers, her tone brittle. "You don't understand. I was maintaining order. I was doing my job." But her words no longer carried authority. They were echoes, bouncing hollow off the wall of judgment that had already closed in around her. The neighbors didn't whisper anymore. They shouted openly, their voices layered into a verdict. "We saw everything," one man called out. "It's all on tape," another added, waving his phone like a torch. Linda's composure cracked, her voice turning shrill. "You people don't understand what it takes to run a neighborhood. Keep things proper." Then, in a burst of frustration, the mask slipped completely. Her voice sharpened into a spit of venom. People like you don't belong here. The sentence sliced through the air like a blade. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, explosive. Gasps echoed from porches, murmurs rose into a roar. Parents covered their children's ears, while phones zoomed in closer, capturing every flicker of hate that twisted across her face. A voice rang out. Raw with anger, we all heard it, Linda. Another voice shouted louder, that's enough, you exposed yourself. The crowd erupted, not in confusion but in unified outrage. They weren't debating anymore. They had reached their conclusion. Linda had delivered it herself. The officers no longer hesitated. One stepped forward, his hand firm on her arm. Ma'am, you're coming with us. Linda tried to jerk free, shouting incoherently, but the neighbors weren't sympathetic. Their jeers followed her as the officers began to walk her toward the patrol car. We don't want this anymore, someone yelled. You brought this on yourself, another added. The Hendersons, watching from their porch, shook their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson's voice was heavy but resolute. She thought she was building order. All she built was fear. The officer guiding Linda tightened his grip just enough to keep her moving. Her voice cracked into a shriek. You'll regret this. You need me. Without me, this neighborhood falls apart. But even as she shouted, the crowd drowned her out. Phones stayed high, documenting her unraveling. To everyone watching, she was no longer a leader. She was a cautionary tale. As the patrol car door shut behind her, a final cheer rolled through the block, not triumphant but cathartic, the sound of release after years of quiet resentment. Sean stood frozen at the curb, stripped of his borrowed vest, his face pale. He didn't need to say another word. The neighborhood had already moved past him. By the next morning, the video was everywhere, shared across local groups, reposted on news pages, dissected in comments that all carried the same theme, a leader undone by her own arrogance. Clips of her shouting, people like you don't belong here, trended online, framed with captions of outrage. Within days, the HOA board convened in an emergency session. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled, but the decision was unanimous. Linda was stripped of her title, her position erased. Her seat sat empty at the long table, a silent monument to how quickly power could vanish. The neighbors who once endured her heavy-handed rules now shook hands with each other in relief, voices lighter, freer. What had been hidden tension was now open unity. Linda wasn't defeated by Reginald's badge or the officer's arrival. She was defeated by her own words, by the truth spilling out when her control cracked. The FBI agent hadn't needed to destroy her. She had destroyed herself. And the community, watching as one, delivered the verdict she feared most, not just the loss of power, but the loss of respect. A week later, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if the weight of years had lifted. The lawns were freshly cut. Kids chased each other across front yards without parents peering nervously from windows, and the hush of suspicion that had once followed Reginald Carter was gone. That Saturday, the community gathered in the park, folding chairs spread across the grass, families clustered together while children ran and laughed in the background. The sun hung low, painting everything in a warm gold that made the moment feel almost ceremonial. Reginald hadn't come to give a speech, but when the board's new interim president asked him to say a few words, the crowd hushed instinctively. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, not commanding attention, but receiving it all the same. His voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach the back rows. What happened last week wasn't about lawns or driveways, he said. It wasn't even about me. It was about power. Real authority isn't built on fear. It's built on accountability. The words landed, soft but sharp, drawing nods from parents, from the elderly neighbors who had lived through Linda's reign, even from teenagers who had only seen it through their phone screens. He paused, scanning the faces, letting the quiet do its work. Fear only rules if we let it, he continued. Bullies get away with intimidation when good people stay silent. But when you stand together, when you speak truth out loud, that's when fear loses its grip. Near the edge of the crowd, Marcus lifted his phone, streaming live once again, his eyes locked on Reginald like he was filming more than words. He was filming an example. Reginald glanced at him, a faint smile softening his face. He crouched slightly so his voice met the boy eye to eye. "You showed courage that day." He said, "You didn't look away, you recorded the truth. That matters, but remember something, Marcus. It's not the drama that counts, it's the truth you choose to spread. Use your voice to show people what accountability looks like." Marcus nodded quickly, grinning at the phone. "Yes, sir, that's the plan." The crowd chuckled softly, the tension of the past week dissolving into something brighter. Parents squeezed their children's shoulders. The Hendersons whispered to each other. Mrs. Henderson saying quietly, "He's not just our neighbor anymore. He's the one who reminded us who we are." Phones caught every angle again, but this time the energy was different. It wasn't scandal, it was affirmation. A collective decision to carry forward a lesson that had been bought with embarrassment, with shame, and with the courage of one man standing firm. Reginald straightened, looking across the park at the homes where he and his neighbors lived. "This community doesn't need fear to survive," he said finally. "It needs respect. It needs people willing to serve, not intimidate. That's how we protect each other. That's how we move forward." The applause that followed wasn't raucous. It was steady, heartfelt, the kind that said agreement had turned into conviction. Conversations broke out as people stood, shaking hands, introducing themselves to neighbors they had never spoken to before. Children kept running across the grass, their laughter the clearest sign that the block had begun to heal. As the sun dipped lower, Reginald walked back toward his seat, blending into the crowd instead of standing above it. The badge in his wallet might have won the confrontation, but here in the park, surrounded by his community, it was clear the true strength had come from something else. Not the FBI, not a title, but a neighborhood deciding together that respect, truth, and accountability would outlast fear. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.